She was only 25, but the German army gave her a name whispered in fear. Lady Death, a young woman who traded textbooks for a Mosin-Nagant rifle and rewrote the meaning of courage. 309 confirmed kills. Entire enemy. Eunuchs assigned just to hunt her, but she didn't run. She hunted them back. This is the real story of the most lethal female sniper in all of World War II. War creates many heroes, soldiers, commanders, resistance fighters. But once in a lifetime, war reveals someone so extraordinary that their story becomes legend. Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not grow up dreaming of combat. She was a history student, a quiet girl from Ukraine with sharp eyes, a stubborn spirit, and a belief that knowledge could change the world. But when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, her world changed forever. She walked into the recruitment office, asked for a rifle, and stepped into history. By the end of her service, she would become the deadliest female sniper. Whoever lived, respected by allies, feared by enemies, and remembered as the woman who looked death in the eyes and did not blink. This is her story. Before the world knew her name, before newspapers called her Lady Death, before the German army placed a bounty on her head, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was simply a student, a quiet young woman sitting in the back row of a history lecture. Hall at QU University, scribbling notes on ancient empires, revolutions, and the rise and fall of nations. She loved stories, not the fictional kind, but the real ones. The kind written in dusty archives, forgotten diaries, old battle maps. History to her wasn't just a subject. It was a mirror, proof that ordinary people could shape extraordinary events. And yet, she had no idea that one day she would become one of those people. Lyudmila grew up in a working-class family in Ukraine. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't privileged. She wasn't raised to be a warrior. She was raised to be disciplined, to earn her place through effort, to never accept limitations quietly. At 16, after overhearing a neighborhood boy bragging about his shooting skills, she joined a local shooting club just to prove she could do better. She did. Within a year, she outshot nearly every young man in the district. She earned marksmanship badges, won competitions, and developed a sense of calm behind a rifle that would later define her entire life. But even then, she was not thinking about war. She was thinking about grades, exams, her future career. Life was simple, predictable, ordinary. And then, June 22nd, 1941, the sky over Ukraine shook as Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Cities burned, refugees flooded the roads. QU University shut its doors as thousands rushed to enlist or evacuate. Lyudmila stood in the middle of the chaos, a young woman holding textbooks while the world around her collapsed. She watched classmates flee. She watched families pack everything they owned into carts. She watched soldiers march toward the front with faces pale from fear, but steady with duty, and something inside her hardened. While many searched for safety, she searched for purpose. She made her way to the nearest recruitment office. The line was long, panicked civilians, older men, young boys, all begging for rifles. When her turn came, she stepped forward and said the words she had been rehearsing in her mind. "I want to join the infantry. The officer behind the desk looked up slowly, saw a young woman, thin, serious, dressed like a university student. Not a soldier, he smirked. He offered her a role as a nurse. And Lyudmila Pavlichenko, 24 years old, unafraid to challenge anyone, refused. No, she said. I did not come here to bandage wounds. I came here to fight. The officer frowned. He asked her if she had any experience with weapons. She reached into her bag, pulled out her shooting certificates, medals from competitions, proofs of accuracy, documents signed by instructors, who had once called her one of the finest young marksmen of her generation. That got his attention. They handed her a rifle, a Mosin Nagant, the same rifle that would become a natural extension of her body. They told her to hit 3 targets. She hit all 3, dead center. In seconds. The officer stared at her, in silence for a moment, then stamped her papers. Sniper, he wrote, and like that, a history student became a soldier. She left the office with the uniform barely fitting her, the rifle heavier than she expected, and a mission she could not yet comprehend. That night she sat alone on her barracks bunk, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. She was scared. She later admitted that much. But beneath the fear was something more powerful, conviction. She wasn't fighting for medals. She wasn't fighting for fame. She wasn't even fighting for revenge. She was fighting because her homeland was under attack, because millions needed defending, because history had stepped into her life and demanded a decision. And she made it. The next morning, she boarded a truck with her new unit. The engine roared. Dust filled the air. She looked back at KU University, the building where she once studied the past as it faded behind her. Ahead of her was a different kind of education, one written in blood, mud, and steel. It was on that road, traveling toward Odessa, that Lyudmila Pavlichenko took her first step toward becoming the most feared female sniper who ever lived. But at that moment, she didn't know the future, didn't know the legend she would become, didn't know that soldiers on the other side of a front would one day whisper her name in terror. She was simply a student, answering the call of war. War has a way of stripping illusions. It doesn't ease you in. It throws you straight into the fire. And for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, that fire burned hottest at the gates of Odessa, the place where she would discover what it truly meant to be a soldier. When her unit arrived at the outskirts of the city, the air was already thick with smoke. German and Romanian forces were tightening their grip, pushing through villages, fields, and coastlines with relentless force. Odessa's defenders were exhausted, undersupplied, and vastly outnumbered. They needed every rifle, including hers. The very first morning on the front, she was handed a sniper rifle, a Mosin Nagant 1891 30ths, with a payscope. It was old, heavy, worn by years of use. But in her hands, it felt right, like the instrument she was meant to play. Her unit leader, a rugged veteran named Mikhail Morozov, watched her assemble the rifle with calm precision. He said nothing at first, just observed. Then, with a slight nod, he pointed to a ridge overlooking the plain. "That's your spot," he told her. That was her introduction. No ceremony, no training session, no easing into the role. Just a position, and the expectation that she would do her job, Lyudmila crawled through the dirt to reach it. She felt the earth trembling with distant artillery. She heard the sharp cracks of rifles. She smelled the sulfur, the sweat, the fear. And then she saw him, a German scout moving low through the tall grass, creeping toward Soviet trenches. He was experienced, careful, slow, the kind of man who could slip behind the lines and kill a dozen soldiers before anyone noticed. Through her scope, she could see the details: the worn leather straps on his helmet, the twitch of his fingers on the rifle stock, the breath fogging slightly in the morning air. Her heart pounded. She steadied her elbows. Her finger hovered. Above the trigger, this was the moment everything changed. She had trained for this. She had practiced hundreds of times. But nothing truly prepares you for the first time you aim at another human being. Knowing what will happen if you pull the trigger. A single thought crossed her mind. If I don't stop him, he will kill someone else. The doubt faded. Her breathing slowed, her pulse soft. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, sending a shockwave through her arms. Through the scope she saw the scout fall suddenly, violently, and lie completely still. Her stomach twisted. The world spun. She lowered the rifle and vomited into the dirt, not out of weakness, but out of the sheer weight of the moment. Morozov, her commander, crawled beside her a few minutes later. "It gets easier," he said quietly. She didn't answer, because she didn't want it to get easier. She didn't want to lose her humanity. But even as she wiped her mouth with a shaking hand, something inside her was changing, not hardening, but sharpening, clarifying. She realized that being a sniper wasn't about taking lives. It was about saving them. Every target she eliminated was one less threat to the soldiers behind her. One less man who would throw a grenade into a trench, or shoot a medic, or step over the bodies of civilians. In that moment, in the dirt outside Odessa, she found resolve. Over the next few days, she learned how quickly war pushes you forward. She learned how to control her breath under pressure, how to blend into the landscape, how to become a silhouette, then a shadow, then nothing at all. She learned to wait, and wait, and wait. The sniper's life is not built on action, but on patience. One shot, one life, one decision. And as the siege of Odessa intensified, Lyudmila Pavlichenko would make that decision again, and again, and again. She arrived at the front as a nervous girl with a rifle, but Odessa would shape her into something else, something the world wasn't ready for. The Germans didn't know it yet, but the woman who had just taken her first shot was about to become the most feared sniper on the Eastern Front. War tests everyone, but every once in a while, it reveals something the world has never seen before. Odessa was where Lyudmila Pavlichenko took her first shot. But it was what she did after that moment that began shaping the legend. The siege intensified with every passing hour. German armored units pushed harder. Romanian divisions advanced along the coastline. Aircraft buzzed over the city like vultures circling their prey. Odessa was fighting a battle it was never meant to win, but its defenders refused to yield. And inside that crumbling perimeter, a young woman with a rifle was becoming something extraordinary. In the coming weeks, Lyudmila adapted to the sniper's life with a speed that stunned her commanders. She memorized distances, wind directions, enemy movement patterns. She learned the habits of German scouts, how they crawled, how they probed trenches, how they used shadows to conceal themselves. She learned patience. A sniper's true weapon is not the rifle. It's the ability to wait. She would lie for hours, dusty, motionless, barely breathing, with ants crawling over her hands and flies buzzing around her face. Her muscles would tighten, her legs would go numb, but she never moved until the moment was right. Her fellow soldiers began to notice something unusual about her. They would joke, "Pavlichenko doesn't fire many shots, but when she does, someone never gets up again." Her kill count climbed. 10, 15, 23. Every confirmed hit meant more than a number. It meant an enemy machine gunner silenced, an officer who would no longer rally his troops, a scout who would never slip behind Soviet lines. Each shot, each decision, each calculated breath, they were all threads in the formation of a legend. But legends aren't forged only in skill. They're forged in the eyes of those who witness them. One day, her unit came under sudden mortar fire. Shells rained down, throwing dirt and shrapnel into the air. A Soviet platoon across the ridge fell back in panic until they saw Lyudmila sprinting toward the front, not away from it. She slid into a depression in the ground, took aim, and eliminated 2 German spotters directing the mortar barrage. Without their eyes guiding the bombs, the shelling faltered. The line held. Those who saw her that day never forgot it. Word spread quickly. "There's a girl sniper on the ridge. She takes out scouts before they even see her. Don't worry. Pavlichenko is covering us." Soldiers who had first looked at her with doubt now treated her with respect and a quiet kind of awe. The Germans noticed too. They began warning their men, "Avoid the southern ridge. There is a Russian woman sniper there." They gave her a name, whispered with unease. "Die, Todesfrau, the woman of death." It was meant as an insult. It became her myth. But Lyudmila did not see herself the way they saw her. She wasn't driven by glory or vengeance. She wrote in her diary at the time, "I am here to protect the living, not to celebrate the dead." For her, each shot was an act of defense, a shield that she lifted again and again for the men fighting beside her. She shared trenches with 19-year-old farm boys who had never left their villages, with fathers who carried their children's photos in their breast pockets, with exhausted officers who hadn't slept in days. She ate with them, joked with them, learned their stories, then watched far too many of them die. That is the sniper's curse. You save lives, but you witness their loss every day. And yet, she kept going. By the end of her deployment, in Odessa, her kill count had risen to 40, then 50, then 60. Numbers unheard of for a sniper, her age, her rank, her experience. One evening, as the sun dipped beneath the Black Sea and painted the sky a deep red, her commander approached her quietly. "You're doing more than your share, Pavlichenko," he said. She answered simply, "I am doing what is needed." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't pride. It was purpose. The kind of purpose that only emerges in moments of unimaginable pressure. But Odessa was only the beginning. The true test, the crucible that would transform her from an exceptional sniper into the most feared woman on the Eastern Front, was still ahead. A name that still sends shivers through historians. A place that devoured thousands of soldiers. A siege that lasted 250 days. Sevastopol, and it was there that Lyudmila Pavlichenko would rise from a skilled sniper to a legend. Odessa shaped her skills, but it was Sevastopol that shaped her legend. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko's regiment retreated from Odessa, they were exhausted, battered, and outgunned, yet still alive. Their destination was the last great fortress of the Black Sea, a city carved into cliffs, surrounded by the sea on 3 sides, and offended by soldiers who refused to yield even an inch. Sevastopol, a name that would soon be synonymous with some of the fiercest fighting of the entire Eastern Front. For Lyudmila, this city would become both a proving ground and a crucible, a city under fire the moment she arrived. She could feel the weight of the siege pressing down on everything. The ground trembled daily from German artillery. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Sunlight barely broke through the haze. Civilians huddled in caves. Soldiers slept in trenches carved into limestone. Every hill, ridge, and ruin had a name and a body count. In Sevastopol, you didn't survive by being strong. You survived by becoming harder than the city itself. And for a sniper, this was a hunter's paradise and a death trap. Her first days on the cliffs, Lyudmila chose to position herself along the cliffs overlooking the valley. It was dangerous terrain, barren, exposed, with almost no natural cover. But to her, danger was simply another form of opportunity. She learned how the enemy moved through the ravines, how they used the early morning fog for concealment, how their officers stood just a little too confidently above the trenches. Her kill count rose fast: 70, 90, 110. Each confirmed kill brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that another enemy advance had been stopped. Sorrow that each shot meant one more human being erased from the world. But she never hesitated. Because hesitation on the cliffs of Sevastopol meant death, not just for her, but for the men she protected. The duel of shadows. As her reputation grew, the Germans took notice. Not just foot soldiers, but their best snipers. One of them, an elite marksman with more experience than her, began hunting her specifically. He had studied her patterns. He knew where she hid. He knew her name. For 3 days they fought a duel without words, without movement, without mercy. Each waited for the other to make a mistake. One glint of metal, one shift of shadow, one breath at the wrong moment. Lyudmila lay perfectly still, her body pressed against cold stone, her fingers numb, her skin scraped raw by the cliffs. Hours passed, then an entire night, then another day. She could feel him out there, the same way a predator senses another predator. And on the 3rd day, she saw it, a tiny reflection, no bigger than a raindrop. She didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't blink. She fired. When the Soviet infantry swept the ridge later, they found her enemy sprawled beside a meticulously concealed nest, his rifle pointing toward the exact spot she had been lying. It was her most dangerous shot yet, and the one that cemented her as a threat the Germans could no longer ignore. A reputation written in fire, the Germans began issuing warnings through radio intercepts. Beware the Russian woman sniper. They weren't exaggerating. Lyudmila was averaging multiple confirmed kills a day. She targeted officers, machine gunners, observation crews, the backbone of the German advance. Every bullet she fired slowed the enemy from within. To her comrades, she was hope. To her enemies, she was a rumor that refused to die, and gradually the battlefield began to shift around her presence. Soldiers fought harder when she watched. Over them, commanders assigned her to the most critical sectors. She became more than a sniper. She became a symbol. But legends pay a price. Sevastopol was brutal. The constant bombardments, the exhaustion, the claustrophobic trenches, the endless duels against enemy snipers. Lyudmila endured shrapnel wounds, concussions, near-death moments almost daily, and worst of all, she endured watching friends fall one by one. Yet every morning she returned to her post, because if she didn't, someone else would die. That was the reality of Sevastopol. And in that reality, Lyudmila Pavlichenko carved her legend deeper than bullets into stone. Asterisk, asterisk, by the end of her first months in the city, her confirmed kills had surpassed 150, then 200, then 250. The woman who arrived in Sevastopol as a soldier would leave it as Lady Death. By the time winter winds swept across the cliffs of Sevastopol, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was no longer simply a sniper. She had become a strategic asset, a force multiplier, and a shadow the German army could not shake. The siege tightened. As the weeks dragged on, food grew scarce. Ammunition had to be rationed. Men slept in shallow dugouts carved into stone, listening to the constant rumble of artillery pounding the city day and night. But while the world around her strained under the pressure, Lyudmila grew sharper. Her comrades described her as calm, focused, almost unnervingly steady. She rarely spoke unless necessary. She spent hours studying terrain, wind patterns, and enemy movement. Each morning before dawn, she disappeared into the ruins with her rifle slung across her shoulder, vanishing into the battlefield like smoke. And every evening, someone added another chalk mark to the board, tracking her confirmed. Kills: 160, 180, 200, 235. The numbers seemed unreal, even to those who fought beside her. But Sevastopol was a place where unreal things became normal, because nothing about the siege was normal. German and Romanian divisions threw everything they had at the defender lines. Wave after wave of infantry, machine gun crews, armored vehicles, bombers dropping payloads that shook the coastline. Every advance pushed the Soviets further back. Every counterattack came at a cost measured in blood. And yet every time the Germans tried to break through a weak point, one name kept reappearing in the after-action reports: Pavlichenko. Neutralized their observer. Pavlichenko halted their flank maneuver. Pavlichenko prevented breakthrough in Sector 8. She wasn't fighting for recognition. She was fighting because she saw what happened when snipers failed. Men died blind, unaware, picked apart by unseen rifles. She refused to let that happen on her watch. The day she passed 300 one morning, the fog clung thick over the ravines. Visibility was low, perfect for snipers, dangerous for infantry. German units were attempting a coordinated push, using the fog as cover. Soviet lines risked collapse. Lyudmila crawled into position atop a broken bunker roof, her elbows braced on shattered concrete, her breathing steady. Below her, she could hear the muffled clatter of German boots advancing. She sighted her first target, a squad leader shouting. Orders. She fired. Before the echo faded, she shifted, scanning the fog. A machine gunner took his place. She fired again. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2. By midday, she had dropped a dozen men, each shot deliberate, each one preventing a breakthrough. When she returned to the command post, a clack quietly updated her tally. 304 confirmed kills. For a moment, the room fell silent, not out of celebration, but out of something close to disbelief. She had surpassed the kill count of many of the most decorated snipers in the world, and she was only 20. Yet when someone told her the number, she gave no triumphant smile, no boast. She simply adjusted her rifle strap and said, "Tomorrow will be worse. I need to clean my weapon." The German response by now, her reputation was impossible to ignore. The Germans began broadcasting taunts over loudspeakers, trying to lure her into revealing her position. They shouted her name, mocked her, threatened her. She responded with silence and a bullet whenever one of them stood too tall. Frustrated, German command issued a unique directive. Sniper detachments are to prioritize the elimination of Pavlichenko. They sent their best marksmen. Some never returned. Her favorite diary entry from this period reads simply, "Today they tried to hunt me again. They failed." The psychological war, but her greatest impact wasn't the numbers. It was the fear she instilled. Soldiers on the German line began whispering, "If she's watching, you're already dead. Don't stand. She'll see you. Don't talk. She'll hear you." Pavlichenko had become more than a woman with a rifle. She had become a psychological weapon, a constant reminder that death could come from anywhere at any second. And in war, fear is often more powerful than firepower. Asterisk, asterisk, as spring approached, the siege tightened even further. Lyudmila's body was battered, bruised, and scarred. But her legend only grew stronger. 304 confirmed kills. And the number was still climbing. But every legend, every hero, pays a price. And in Sevastopol, that price was about to come due. 300 confirmed kills. 300 lives stopped by a single pair of steady hands. To outsiders, it sounded mythical, even superhuman. But to Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the number carried a weight heavier than any rifle she ever held. As the siege of Sevastopol dragged on, the battlefield no longer felt like a place made of earth and stone. It felt like a living thing, always growling, always hungry, always demanding more. And Lyudmila had already given it so much. In the winter of 1942, exhaustion carved itself into the faces of every defender. The trenches smelled of smoke, metal, and human despair. Rats scurried through dugouts. Supplies dwindled. Soldiers shared the last scraps of bread and joked about hunger because jokes were easier than fear. But Lyudmila didn't joke. She rarely slept. Her body ached constantly, knees worn raw from hours of lying on broken rock, elbows bruised from recoil, eyes strained from endless days behind glass. Some mornings she woke with her rifle already in her hands. She didn't remember picking it up. That's what war does. It blurs the line between surviving and existing. The toll of loss. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the loss. Lyudmila fought beside young men who became like family, boys who still talked about their mother's cooking, men who carried tiny portraits of wives in their breast pockets, soldiers who shared cigarettes, laughter, and nightmares in the same night. and one by one, they disappeared. Some fell to artillery blasts that shook the earth itself. Some were taken by snipers lurking in the same shadows. Lyudmila mastered. Some simply vanished in the chaos, swallowed by smoke and rubble. She kept a small notebook where she wrote their names. It filled quickly. Every entry carved another scar into her spirit. She once wrote, "I did not fear death. I feared being the last of my friends." This was the real cost of greatness. Not the kills, not the fame, but carrying the ghosts of those who never left the trenches. The day she almost didn't return one afternoon, while covering a retreat through a ravine, Lyudmila crawled onto a ridge to eliminate a machine gun crew pinning down Soviet infantry. It was a perfect position, which meant someone else would eventually find it too. She took out the gunner, then his loader, but before she could shift her scope to the third target, the world turned white. A mortar shell slammed into the ground just meters away. The blast threw her backward, knocked the breath from her lungs, and buried her beneath a shower of earth and stone. For a moment, the first time since the war began, she felt real fear. Not fear of dying, fear of failing. Fear that her comrades would be left exposed, because she wasn't there. 2 soldiers dragged her from the rubble. Her face was bleeding. Her left ear rang with a high-pitched scream that would never fully fade. Her ribs throbbed with every breath. The medics insisted she rest. She refused. With shaking hands, she cleaned the dirt from her rifle, chambered around, and said through gritted teeth, "There are still men counting on me." The commander stared at her, part awe, part worry, but he knew better than to argue. Lyudmila returned to the cliffs that very same evening, because legends don't rest. And Sevastopol didn't give anyone time to heal. The scars you can't see by now. Rumors about her had grown beyond anything she recognized. Soviet newspapers painted her as unstoppable. German soldiers whispered her name like a curse. But legends always look cleaner in stories than in reality. In reality, Lyudmila was exhausted, bruised, barely holding herself together. She carried shrapnel in her legs from earlier wounds. Her hands trembled after long battles, hidden behind gloves so no one would see. Her eyes burned from endless days in wind, cold, and sun glare. Sometimes, when alone, she cried quietly, not from fear, but from the crushing heaviness of being alive when so many others were not. Yet each dawn she rose, because the men in the trenches fought on, because the city still stood, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender was something she had never learned. By spring, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become more than the most lethal woman in sniper history. She had become a symbol of defiance, a reminder to the defenders of Sevastopol that even when the world was collapsing, one person's courage could hold the line. But symbols are valuable, too valuable, and soon the Soviet command would make a decision that would change her destiny forever. Because the Germans weren't the only ones who realized what Lyudmila meant to the war. By the spring of 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become something far more dangerous than a sniper. She was a symbol, a living warning, a psychological weapon. The German army had faced Soviet snipers before, many of them precise, ruthless, and deadly. But they had never seen anything like her. 300 confirmed kills was not just a statistic, it was a rupture in German tactics. Officers hesitated to show themselves. Scouts crawled instead of walking. Machine gunners constantly shifted positions. Every man in her sector moved with the unspoken fear that she, the unseen, was watching. Fear is the most efficient weapon in war. It requires no ammunition, and Pavlichenko wielded it with perfect accuracy. The Germans decided they'd had enough. The hunt begins in April. German High Command issued a special directive throughout the 11th Army. Find the sniper known as Lady Death, not neutralize, not discourage, eliminate. Sniper detachments were reassigned solely to hunt her. They studied the terrain she favored, the timings she preferred, the patterns she unwittingly followed. They mapped every ridge, every crater, every collapsed bunker she might be using for cover. And they grew bolder. Loudspeakers blared across the lines. Russian girl, your end is coming soon. Lady Death, we are waiting for you. She ignored the taunts, not because she felt invincible, but because she understood, something the Germans never expected. The moment you try too hard to kill someone, you reveal exactly how dangerous they are. The loss that changed her one morning. A young sniper named Leonid, a friend she had trained with. Someone she had shared jokes and rations with, failed to return from a mission. Lyudmila knew instantly what had happened. She recognized the pattern, the silence, the lack of movement, the unnatural stillness along the ridge. A German counter-sniper had taken him. She didn't cry, not then. She simply picked up her rifle and crawled toward the ridge, inch by inch, through broken glass and jagged rock, studying the angles the shot could have come from. 2 hours passed, then 3, and finally, she found the nest, perfectly concealed, expertly camouflaged, an ambush designed specifically to kill her. The German sniper lay inside, his rifle still pointed toward the slope where she had often watched the valley. She fired once. The duel ended, but the grief did not. Later that day, she wrote in her diary, "This is the cost. Every victory takes someone I care about." The pressure mounts as weeks passed. Lyudmila's body grew tired. She slept in 5-minute intervals. She barely ate. Her hands were blistered and cracked from hours gripping cold steel. But she refused to leave her post. Her commanders begged her to rest. She refused. They tried to rotate her out. She returned before sunrise, because she believed, truly believed, that every man on the line lived a little longer whenever she was there. But then came the moment that changed everything. The blast late one afternoon. While repositioning after a successful engagement, a German mortar team zeroed in on her sector. The explosion came without warning, a deafening roar that tore the earth open beneath her feet. The blast threw her backward. Shrapnel ripped across her face. Blood poured into her eye. Her ears rang with a piercing scream that wouldn't fade. She tried to stand, and collapsed. She tried to crawl, and the world spun sideways. For the first time since the war began, she felt herself slipping out of consciousness. Comrades dragged her from the crater. She fought them, insisting she could still fight. She tried to reach for her rifle. Her hands wouldn't close around it. The decision she feared most when the medical officers examined her wounds. They didn't see a sniper. They saw a strategic asset too valuable to lose. High Command issued the order. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was to be evacuated from Sevastopol immediately. She protested. She begged. She tried to stand, to prove she could still fight. But her body betrayed her. Her vision blurred with blood. Her legs trembled. Her hands shook. And in that moment, she understood the truth. She wasn't being saved. She was being taken off the battlefield because her legend had become more valuable than her presence on the line. As the boat carrying her away pulled from the harbor, under enemy shell fire. Lyudmila looked back at the cliffs of Sevastopol, the place where she had become Lady Death, and she wondered whether she would ever forgive herself for leaving the men she fought beside. But fate had other plans for her, plans even she could not imagine. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived in the hospital tent far from the front, she felt something she had not felt since the war began. Helplessness. Her wounds healed slowly. The ringing in her ears faded, but never fully disappeared. Her vision returned, but remained blurred on the edges. Her once steady hands trembled when she held her rifle. Worst of all, she felt separated from the men still fighting in Sevastopol, from the cliffs, the rubble, the endless duels that had defined her life for months. She was alive, but she felt she had abandoned her comrades. The order that changed everything, Soviet High Command, had no intention of sending her back to the battlefield, not because they doubted her ability, but because they feared losing her legend. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was no longer just a soldier. She was a symbol, a living icon of Soviet resistance. Her name appeared in newspapers. Her story inspired thousands of recruits. Her kill count echoed across the front like a battle cry. And so came an unexpected assignment. Lyudmila would travel abroad to speak for the Soviet Union. Her battleground would no longer be the cliffs of Sevastopol. It would be the world stage, the United States tour in the summer of 1942. She boarded a transport ship to America, the first Soviet citizen ever invited to the White House. She was only 25 years old. When she stepped onto American soil, she was greeted by curious crowds, photographers, and reporters eager to understand how a young woman had become one of the deadliest snipers in history. She met President Roosevelt. She met Eleanor Roosevelt, who became both her guide and her friend. She toured factories, military bases, and civic halls. At first, she was shy, uncomfortable with the attention, awkward in front of microphones. She missed the battlefield, the comradeship, the simplicity of purpose. But something changed one night in Chicago. The speech that shook America, standing before a crowd of thousands. Lyudmila listened as reporters shouted questions, many of them trivial, even condescending. Do you wear makeup at the front? Do women fight as well as men? Do you curl your hair before missions? She stared at them, calm, steady, unimpressed. Then she leaned forward and said the words that would echo across the United States. Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascists. Do you not think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long? The crowd erupted. The press fell silent, and America for the first time truly understood who she was. The legend grows. Her speeches ignited support for a second front in Europe. American women, inspired by her courage, volunteered for wartime service. Soldiers called her a hero. Civilians saw her as living proof of resilience. She was no longer just a sniper. She was the global face of wartime resistance. And yet, in quiet moments, Lyudmila admitted that no applause could ever replace the friends she lost. By the time she returned home, she was celebrated as a national hero, decorated, honored, revered. But fame cannot erase scars, and the war she returned to was not the same one she left. Because while she had been speaking to the world, Sevastopol had fallen. In segment 9, we see how a hero returns from war and discovers the cost of survival. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned from her American speaking tour, she arrived not as a sniper, but as a hero. Crowds greeted her. Officials praised her. Her uniform was decorated with the medals of a legend. But behind her calm expression, she carried a weight that no applause could lift. Because while she crossed oceans to rally support for a second front, the front she had left behind, Sevastopol, had fallen. The cliffs where she fought, the trenches where she lost friends, the ridges where she built her legacy, were now in enemy hands. And the men who had stood beside her, the soldiers she had protected with every shot, were either dead or prisoners. For the first time since she left the battlefield, Lyudmila felt the one emotion she had always pushed away, survivor's guilt, a hero. With no war left to fight, she asked command if she could return to the front. They refused. Her fame had grown too large. Her presence was now more valuable than her rifle. She had become a symbol, and symbols were not allowed to die. Lyudmila was assigned to train new snipers instead. It was important work, vital even. The Red Army needed sharpshooters more than ever. But teaching others how to kill never felt the same as doing it herself. She missed the clarity of the battlefield, the singular purpose that had defined her life. Now, instead of lying in the dirt for hours, watching valleys through a scope, she sat in classrooms, giving lectures to recruits who stared at her with wide, awestruck eyes. They studied her like a legend, but she still felt like a soldier, one who had been forced to leave her war unfinished. The unseen wounds physically, she never fully recovered. Shrapnel lodged in her body continued to ache in cold weather. Her hearing in one ear never returned to normal. Her vision, once razor-sharp, blurred under strain. She experienced dizzy spells that left her holding onto railings for balance. Emotionally, the wounds were deeper. She had lived through months of constant death. She had held dying comrades in her arms. She had buried friends with her own hands. She had killed more men than most entire platoons. And yet, in the quiet years after the war, she felt almost invisible. Civilians did not understand what she had endured. They listened to her medals, not her memories. They asked about her kill count, not the cost behind it. The press wanted stories of heroism. They did not ask about nightmares, about the weight of 300 names, about the crippling silence after years of gunfire, the return to history in the years that followed. Lyudmila returned to her studies. She finished her degree. She worked as a historian. The career she once imagined before war twisted her destiny. She poured herself into research, writing, teaching, but she never distanced herself from her past. She visited war memorials, spoke at commemorations, and met with families of soldiers she once fought beside. When she walked through the halls of military museums, soldiers stood straighter. Young recruits whispered her name with reverence. Even generals bowed their heads. Because legends don't fade. Their shadows remain long after their battles end. The quiet years, Lyudmila never married. She tried once, but the scars of war had carved too deeply into her heart. She remained close to her comrades, especially women who served beside her. In her later years, she lived alone in a small apartment in Moscow, surrounded by books, old photographs, and fading letters from soldiers long gone. Sometimes, neighbors heard her pacing late at night, the rhythm slow, steady, almost like she was counting steps on a battlefield again. She didn't speak of her nightmares. She carried them privately, the way she once carried her rifle. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974 at the age of 50. She lived quietly, humbly, but never insignificantly. She was not just Lady Death. She was a scholar, a soldier, a survivor, and a reminder that the strongest warriors are often the ones who didn't ask to be. And in segment 10, we honor what her life truly meant, not just to the Soviet Union, but to the world. History is often written by generals, politicians, and nations, but sometimes it is written by a young woman with a rifle, lying alone in the dirt, choosing courage when the world around her collapses. Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not set out to become a legend. She never asked for the title Lady Death. She never boasted about her numbers, never claimed superiority, never glamorized what she did. She simply answered a call that millions of others answered to, but few carried as far as she did. The legend beyond war, her 309 confirmed kills remain, the highest ever recorded for a female sniper. But the number, impressive as it is, does not define her legacy. What defines her is the courage behind each shot, the discipline behind each decision, the unshakable resolve to protect the men beside her, even when she was surrounded by loss. In the Soviet Union, children learned her story in school. Statues were erected in her honor. Her rifle and uniform were placed behind glass in museums. But beyond the Soviet borders, her legend took on a different meaning. She became a symbol for women around the world, proof that bravery has no gender, that strength is not measured by size or voice, and that one person can reshape the course of war. The global impact in the United States. She is remembered as the woman who silenced a crowd of skeptics with a single line. I have killed 309 fascists. Do you not think, gentlemen, you have been hiding behind my back for too long? American newspapers called her the girl who stopped an army. Hollywood wrote script treatments about her life. Female soldiers in the US military would later cite her as inspiration. Even her enemies respected her. German documents recovered after the war described her as one of the most dangerous snipers of the entire Eastern Front, the human behind the legend. But for all the myth and admiration, Lyudmila was still human, still the student who once dreamed of being a historian, still the young woman who collected medals she never wanted, still the soldier who carried grief like a second uniform. She remained loyal to the memories of those she fought beside. She visited veterans' reunions, spoke softly to widows of fallen comrades, and honored the men who gave everything. For her, the end of the war did not erase the faces of those who didn't return. The final view of history as she aged. She often walked the halls of military museums alone. Visitors who didn't recognize her passed by, unaware that the woman studying an exhibit was the subject of one in the next room. But she didn't need recognition. She didn't need applause, because she knew deeply, quietly, that her story would outlive her. History had already claimed her place. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's life was proof that courage is not born, it is chosen. She chose it on the first day of war. She chose it through pain, fear, and loss. She chose it when she stepped onto foreign soil to speak for her people. And she chose it again when she returned to a quiet life, carrying the weight of a world she helped protect. Legends fade. Statues weather. Names disappear from textbooks, but the story of Lady Death, the young woman who fought armies with a single rifle, will echo as long as history remembers what courage looks like. History loves loud heroes, the generals who command armies, the politicians who sign treaties, the nations that rise and fall. But sometimes, the world is changed by someone who speaks softly, who moves in silence, who lies alone in the dirt with a rifle and makes a choice no one will ever fully understand. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was only 25 years old when the world called her Lady Death, But behind the nickname was a human being, a student, a daughter, a friend, a woman who never asked for the war that shaped her. She didn't choose fame. She didn't choose legend. She chose courage, not once, but hundreds of times. In moments when courage was the only thing standing between life and death. She carried a rifle, but she also carried the weight of every soldier she couldn't save. She survived the war, but carried the scars long after the guns went silent. And maybe that is what makes her story endure. Not the number of enemies she stopped, but the number of people she protected. Her name may fade from textbooks. Monuments may gather dust. Wars may be analyzed and debated by people who never heard a single shot. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of history, the echo of her courage remains. A reminder that bravery is not born from strength, but from sacrifice, from love, from the simple belief that one person can make a difference, even when the world is burning. She walked into war as a student of history. She walked out as someone who changed it, and long after her footsteps vanished, the legend of Lady Death still walks beside us,